Out here in the Arizona territory, a rope can mean two things. It can pull a man from a flooding river, save his life, or it can bind a woman like cattle, leaving her to bleed out in the dust. That's the kind of West that Elias Carter knew, the kind he lived with every single day. And one late afternoon, with the sun bleeding all over the horizon, he rode straight into the kind of trouble that no man ever asked for. But let me ask you something right now. If you were on that trail and you saw what he saw, what would you do? Would you kick your horse and ride on? Pretend you never saw a thing? Or would you stop? Think about it. Be honest, because your answer changes everything. Elias slowed his horse, a big roan named Dust Devil, as the sun dipped low. The sky was on fire, all gold and orange smeared across the plains. But it was the silence that got him. It was a deep, heavy quiet. The kind of quiet that gets in your gut and twists it, because anyone who's lived long enough out here knows that kind of silence isn't peace. It's a warning. Then he saw it, a busted wagon, tilted over like a broken bone. One wheel snapped clean off its axle. It just sat there, half dead in the dirt. Most folks would have just ridden past. A busted wagon usually means busted dreams, and there were enough of those in the territory already. But Elias wasn't most folks. He swung down from his saddle, his boots crunching on the gravel, his eyes scanning every shadow. And what he found wasn't just splintered wood and torn canvas. It was flesh and blood. She was sprawled across the wagon bed, her wrists tied so tight with coarse rope they were rubbed raw and bleeding. Her body was a roadmap of bruises, dark and ugly like thunderclouds. Her dress was ripped, stained with dirt and streaks of dried blood. But her face, even battered and pale, there was a fragile beauty to it. He thought she was dead. The desert has a way of swallowing people whole, without so much as a whisper. But then her eyes fluttered open. They were weak, searching, lost. And she spoke with a voice so thin and cracked it was like dry leaves skittering across stone. She whispered 3 words. He sent them. That's all she said. Not help me, not save me. He sent them. The words cut through Elias deeper than any knife. His hand went to the hilt of his own blade, his heart starting to pound a rhythm against his ribs. For a half second, he wondered if he was looking at a ghost. But ghosts don't bleed. Ghosts don't whisper secrets with their last breath. And right there, under that burning Arizona sky, Elias Carter knew his life had just taken a sharp, dangerous turn. He could get back on his horse. He could ride away and forget he ever saw her, just like so many men would have. Or he could step into a storm that was bigger and darker than anything he could possibly imagine. Because out here in the West, you don't go looking for trouble. Trouble finds you. Elias didn't hesitate for long. He pulled his knife, the steel glinting in the dying light, and sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The fibers had dug deep grooves into her skin, angry and red. He gave her a sip of water from his canteen, his hand steadying hers as she drank like a woman who hadn't seen water in days. She coughed, sputtering, but the life was slowly seeping back into her eyes. For a long time she just breathed. Each inhale was a battle, a small victory against the death that had been circling her. Finally she spoke again, her voice a little stronger this time. My name is Clara Monroe. The name hit Elias like a bucket of ice water. Monroe. Samuel Monroe was one of the richest, most powerful landowners in the whole territory. He had more acres than most men had seen, more cattle than you could count in a week. And the whispers said his land wasn't just good for grazing. They said it held silver, a whole lot of it. A name like Monroe wasn't just a name, it was a target. Clara's eyes filled with tears as she pushed out the rest of her story. It came out in a torrent, like a river breaking through a dam. She said 3 men had taken her, hard-faced riders with nothing but greed burning in their eyes. They'd sent a message to her father, Samuel, demanding a ransom so high it could buy a small town, lock, stock, and barrel. But her father had refused. She choked on the words. He refused to pay. He wouldn't trust a single gold coin to a pack of killers, figuring they'd just take his money and put a bullet in her anyway. When the gold never arrived, the men turned mean, vicious. They dragged her across the desert, their new plan even uglier. They were going to sell her, Sell her off to some other wealthy man who wanted both her and the land she was set to inherit. Her voice cracked, but she kept talking, the truth spilling out of her like it had been burning a hole in her chest. They wanted to break me, she whispered, her eyes fixed on something far away. And then there were riders, closing in. They panicked. Elias's jaw was clenched so tight it ached. Suddenly, it all made sense. The busted wagon, the snapped wheel, the girl left for dead. The kidnappers had been chased, maybe by a posse, maybe by bounty hunters. And in their desperate scramble to get away, they cut loose what they thought was dead weight. They figured the buzzards in the sun would finish the job they started. But they were wrong. Fate, it seemed, had other plans. Elias looked at Clara Monroe. Her dress was in tatters, her body was a mess of cuts and bruises, but her spirit was still there. He'd seen tough men give up for less. He'd buried friends who had fewer wounds than she did. And yet here she was, clinging to life with nothing but sheer, stubborn will. The sun was almost gone now, the shadows stretching long and black across the dirt. Elias felt the crushing weight of his decision. This wasn't just some random girl he'd found. This was the daughter of a man who could shake the entire territory with a single command. Helping her meant he wasn't just helping a victim. He was stepping into a war that could get his ranch burned to the ground and him put in a shallow grave. And this is where you need to lean in a little closer, because this was no longer a story about a broken wagon. This was the first spark of a wildfire, and Elias Carter was standing right in the middle of it. Elias didn't waste a second. He lifted Clara, who was as light as a bundle of sticks, onto Dust Devil. He mounted up behind her, holding her steady with one arm as he urged the horse into a slow, careful walk back toward his ranch. Every bump, every jostle of the trail drew a pained wince from her, but she held on, her head resting against his back. By the time they saw the faint, flickering light of his ranch house, the sky was a blanket of black velvet pricked with stars. He carried her inside, laid her gently on his own cot, and did what he could to clean her wounds. The small house was silent, the lantern light throwing dancing shadows on the rough wooden walls. But Elias knew deep in his bones that silence never lasts long in the West. He was right. The next morning, before the sun had even cleared the mountains, the sharp crack of hoofbeats shattered the morning calm. Elias was on the porch in an instant, his rifle in his hands. He saw a lone rider coming, moving at a steady, confident pace. As the man got closer, Elias could make out his features. He was lean, with a nasty scar that cut across his jaw from his ear to his chin. His eyes were small and sharp, like a rattlesnake's. Elias recognized the look. He'd seen it before in bar fights and on battlefields. This wasn't a lost traveler. This was one of them. The rider pulled his horse to a halt, spitting a wad of tobacco into the dust. "You got something that belongs to us," he called out, his voice flat and cold and mean. Elias didn't say a word. He just shifted his grip on the rifle, the worn wood familiar in his hands. The silence stretched between them, pulled tight like a rope about to snap. The man swung down from his horse, his spurs jingling as he swaggered closer. He wasn't here for a conversation. He was here to take what he came for. But what he hadn't counted on was Elias Carter. Years of hard work and harder living had forged Elias into something tougher than ironwood. The fight, when it came, was fast and brutal. A sudden lunge, a desperate struggle in the dirt. It was all fists and boots and grunts of pain. From inside the house, Clara heard the chaos and her heart seized with a cold dread. Death had found her again. The outlaw pulled a knife, the blade flashing in the morning sun. He slashed at Elias, but Elias was quicker. He caught the man's wrist, twisted it with a sickening crack of bone, and slammed him hard against a fence post. The outlaw staggered back, his face a mask of shock and pain, and collapsed into the dust. Defeated, the man spat a mouthful of blood. He struggled back to his horse, his eyes burning with a furious, hateful fire. He rode off without another word, but the look on his face said everything. Elias stood there, his chest heaving, dust swirling around his boots. He knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't even the beginning of the end. That man would be back, and he wouldn't be alone. And here's the part you need to remember. When one outlaw finds out where you live, it's never just one fight. It's a declaration of war. Elias didn't even try to sleep that night. He sat in a chair by the door, his rifle resting across his knees, the lantern turned down so low it barely cast a glow. He listened. Listened for the sound of hoofbeats in the dark, the sound he knew was coming. Clara rested on the cot, tossing and turning in a fitful sleep, whispering names and pleas in her dreams. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, was a reminder that trouble had found his doorstep, and it was going to come knocking again. By the time the sun rose, casting a pale gray light over the land, he'd made his decision. He couldn't stay here, not anymore. The scarred man would bring the others, and when a pack of hungry wolves come sniffing around, one man, no matter how tough, can't hold them off forever. Clara needed more than just his grit and his rifle. She needed the law. He saddled Dust Devil, gently helped Clara mount up, and they set off for Dry Creek, a small, dusty town about an hour's ride to the east. The prairie stretched out around them, wide and empty, the golden grass swaying under a sky so blue it felt like a mockery of the danger that was nipping at their heels. For Clara, every jolt of the horse was fresh pain, but she clung to Elias, her hand resting on his shoulder. "I trust you," she whispered, and for some reason, that was enough to steady his resolve. When they rode into Dry Creek, Elias headed straight for the one building that mattered, the sheriff's office. Sheriff Tom Harding was a man Elias knew well. They had ridden together in the war, bled on the same battlefields when the world was tearing itself apart. Tom was a little broader now, his hair more gray than brown, but his eyes still had the same hard fire in them. The sheriff took one look at Clara's bruised face, and the rags of her dress, and a low curse rumbled in his chest. "Lord above, Elias," he said, his voice grim. "What in the hell happened here?" Elias told him everything, the whole story, just as Clara had told it to him. 3 men, a ransom demand, a father's refusal, a broken wagon, a girl left for dead in the desert. Tom listened, his jaw tightening with every word. When Elias finished, the sheriff slammed his open palm down on his desk so hard the inkwell jumped. "They won't get away with it," he growled. "Not in my county. Not on my watch." He immediately called for his deputies, had Clara taken over to the doctor's house to be properly cared for, and he looked Elias straight in the eye. He promised him that when those outlaws came back, he and the full force of the law in Dry Creek would be standing with him. For the first time since he'd found her by that broken wagon, Elias felt a small bit of the weight lift from his shoulders. Clara was safe, at least for now. But safe is a word that doesn't mean much out here in the West. It's a temporary condition, a brief pause between storms. Elias knew the fight wasn't over. It was just moving to a bigger stage, a stage where lawmen and outlaws were about to collide head-on. And that collision was going to be something to see. Back at the ranch, the dust from Elias's horse had barely settled when 3 riders appeared over the horizon. They moved with a grim purpose, their faces hard and weathered, their eyes as cold as a winter night. The one in the lead was the man with the scar, his jaw swollen and purple from his meeting with Elias. When they found the small ranch house empty, a cold fury rippled through them. "He took her," the scarred man spat, his voice a low growl. "Damn fool thinks he can hide her." They stormed the house, kicking open the door. They overturned the simple wooden table, smashed the few plates Elias owned, looking for any sign, any clue. But all they found was silence. And for angry men, silence is a dangerous thing. With no Clara to drag out and no Elias to fight, they decided to send a different kind of message. The barn went up first. The old dry wood caught instantly, and flames roared into the clear blue sky, a pillar of black smoke rising high enough to be seen for miles. Then they set fire to the house itself. The flames licked at the walls, turning the work of a lifetime into nothing more than kindling. Elias's home, the one piece of the world he'd carved out for himself, was turning to ash. In Dry Creek, Elias stood with Sheriff Harding, watching the doctor's house, completely unaware that his whole life was going up in smoke. Clara was resting inside, pale and weak, but alive. She had gripped Elias's hand earlier and whispered that she was afraid it wasn't over. Elias had squeezed her hand back. "I know," he'd said. "The West never lets things end that easy." That night, the three outlaws rode into town. They came under the cover of darkness, moving like ghosts. They tied their horses behind the saloon and melted into the shadows, listening, watching. A few shots of whiskey in the right ears can loosen a lot of tongues, and it didn't take them long to learn exactly what they wanted to know. The girl was alive, and she was right here, in Dry Creek. As the town clock prepared to strike midnight, Elias felt it. It was a change in the air, the weight of unseen eyes watching from the darkness. He stepped out of the sheriff's office, his rifle once again in his hands, and his eyes scanned the empty street. He caught the faint, almost silent shuffle of a boot on the dusty boardwalk down by the general store. They were here. Sheriff Harding came out to stand beside him, a double-barreled shotgun held ready. Deputies were positioned in the darkened doorways along Main Street. But Elias knew men like this, men who lived by violence and greed. They didn't scare easy. They weren't here to sneak away with the girl. They were here to finish what they started, and they were willing to burn the whole town down to do it. And this is where you need to hold on tight. Because what happened next wasn't just some ordinary standoff. This was the kind of night that the folks in Dry Creek would be whispering about for generations to come. The first gunshot cracked the night air like a whip, and in that single violent instant, the silence of Dry Creek was shattered. The whole town erupted. Rifles thundered from rooftops and darkened windows. The sound of gunfire echoed off the wooden storefronts as Main Street turned into a war zone. Elias fired from the steps of the sheriff's office, his movements calm and measured. Every shot was precise. Beside him, Sheriff Harding's shotgun boomed, sending blasts of buckshot into the shadows. The three outlaws fought back like cornered animals, wild and vicious. The scarred rider was in the middle of the street, barking orders, his revolver spitting fire. One of the outlaws, a big burly man, made a desperate charge, a long knife flashing in the moonlight. Elias met him head-on. They crashed together in the middle of the street, grappling in the dust, a chaotic mess of fists and fury. Elias caught the man's wrist, twisted it hard, and used his own momentum to slam him into the ground. The knife clattered away into the darkness. The second outlaw tried to flank them, slipping between some barrels outside the saloon. Harding saw the movement. He leveled his shotgun, and the resulting blast lit up the street like a bolt of lightning. The man was thrown backward, his gun skittering across the dirt. That just left the scarred rider. He stood alone in the middle of the street, facing Elias, his eyes blazing with a pure, white-hot hatred. "She should have died out there," he screamed, his voice raw with rage. He raised his revolver and fired. The shot was wild, tearing through the air and splintering the wood of the doorframe just past Elias's shoulder. Elias leveled his own rifle, taking steady aim right at the man's chest. But just as he was about to squeeze the trigger, something stopped him, a flicker of movement in the man's eyes. It wasn't just hate, it was desperation. It was something else. Before he could pull the trigger, Harding's deputies closed in, swarming the lone outlaw from all sides. They wrestled him to the ground, the weight of the law finally pressing him down into the dust. The sharp snap of shackles echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. It was over. The door to the doctor's house opened, and Clara stepped out onto the porch. She was pale, wrapped in a blanket, but she was standing. Her eyes found Elias across the street, and in that one look, 1,000 things were said without a single word. She didn't just see a man who had saved her. She saw a man who had stood against the darkness when it came hunting for her. A few days later, a polished black carriage rolled into town, pulled by 4 magnificent horses. Samuel Monroe stepped out. He was a tall, imposing man with eyes as hard as granite. He embraced his daughter, his face a mixture of relief and fury. He gave Elias a firm, brief handshake and a nod of thanks. But it was Clara who lingered. As she was led to the carriage, her eyes met Elias's one last time, a look that promised this story was far from over. The carriage rolled away, leaving Elias standing alone in the dusty street. His ranch was gone, turned to ash and embers. All he had to his name were the clothes on his back and the rifle in his hand. And here's the lesson the West never lets you forget. Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. It can leave you with nothing but scars and memories. But in the end, it's what defines who you are. Now, as Elias stood there, watching the dust from that carriage settle, A thought burrowed into his mind, that whisper he'd first heard from Clara. He sent them, and the outlaw's last desperate scream. She should have died out there. Something didn't add up. The pieces didn't fit. Was this really just a story of a brave rancher saving a helpless victim? Or was it something else entirely? A spark in the desert that was about to ignite into a full-blown inferno. And what if the man who saved the girl had saved the wrong person? Elias couldn't shake it. The feeling was like a burr under a saddle blanket, a constant, irritating prickle of wrongness. He replayed the events over and over in his mind. Clara's first words, the way the scarred outlaw had fought with a desperation that went beyond simple greed. It was personal. He walked back to the sheriff's office. Tom Harding was there, cleaning his shotgun, a grimly satisfied look on his face. The two surviving outlaws were locked in the cells, silent and sullen. "Tom," Elias said, his voice low, "something's not right about all this." Harding looked up, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean, Elias? We got him. The girl is safe with her father. It's over." "Is it?" Elias pressed. "When I found her, the first thing she said to me wasn't, 'Help me.' It was, 'He sent them.'" The sheriff stopped cleaning his gun. He set it down on the desk with a soft thud. "She was delirious, son, beaten half to death. Probably didn't know what she was saying." "Maybe," Elias conceded. "But what about the leader, the one with the scar? When he was cornered, he screamed that she should have died. That's a strange thing for a kidnapper to yell." It wasn't about the money anymore. Harding sighed, leaning back in his chair. "These are bad men, Elias. Trying to find logic in their actions is a fool's errand. You did a good thing. You saved a life. Let that be the end of it. Go get yourself a drink. You've earned it." But Elias couldn't let it go. He walked over to the cells. The scarred rider, whose name he'd learned was Jed, was slumped on the cot, staring at the stone wall. The other man was asleep, or pretending to be. "Who is he?" Elias asked, his voice barely a whisper through the bars. Jed didn't even look at him. "Go to hell, rancher." "The man who sent you," Elias clarified. "Who was it?" Jed slowly turned his head. His eyes were full of a tired, bitter poison. "You really want to know?" he sneered. "You really want to pull on that thread and see what unravels? You think you're the hero in this story, don't you? Riding in, saving the pretty girl." He let out a harsh, dry laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "You're not the hero," Jed whispered, his voice dripping with venom. "You're the fool who just ruined everything." Before Elias could ask another question, Sheriff Harding was there, grabbing his arm. "That's enough, Elias. Let them be. They'll have their say at the trial." His grip was like iron. Harding walked Elias to the door of the office. "You look tired," the sheriff said, his voice softening. "You lost your home. Samuel Monroe left a reward for you, a big one, enough to build a new ranch, twice the size of your old one. It's the least he could do." The offer of money felt wrong. It felt like a payment to keep his mouth shut. Elias spent the next day wandering the town in a daze. The reward money was waiting for him at the bank, a staggering sum, but he couldn't bring himself to claim it. He felt like a pawn in a game he didn't understand, and every move he made was pushing the pieces into a more dangerous configuration. He ended up at the livery stable, talking to the old man who ran the place, an old prospector named Silas, who'd seen more of the territory than any mapmaker. Elias bought him a whiskey and just let him talk. He talked about gold strikes, Indian raids, and the changing of the seasons. And then he said something that made the hairs on the back of Elias's neck stand up. "Funny thing," Silas mused, stroking his white beard. "Saw that fancy Monroe carriage about a week ago, heading out on the Old East Trail, the one that goes past Dead Man's Gulch. Odd place for a man like Monroe to be." Dead Man's Gulch. That was less than 2 miles from where Elias had found the broken wagon. And according to Silas, the carriage was out there days before the kidnapping was even supposed to have happened. The lie was starting to fray at the edges. Elias felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had to know the truth. Not just a piece of it, all of it. He needed to talk to the one person who could give it to him. Clara. He used some of the cash he had in his pocket to buy the fastest horse at the livery. He didn't know exactly where the Monroe Ranch was, only that it was a day's hard ride to the north. As he rode out of Dry Creek, he didn't notice the pair of eyes watching him from the sheriff's office window. Sheriff Harding stood there, his face like a thundercloud, as he watched Elias disappear into the heat haze of the desert. Then he turned to his deputy. "Saddle up," he said, his voice cold and hard. "He knows." The ride was long and brutal. The sun beat down relentlessly, but Elias pushed on, fueled by a gnawing suspicion that was growing with every mile. He was no longer just a rancher who'd stumbled into trouble. He was a man hunting for a truth that he was starting to suspect was uglier than anything he'd ever imagined. He found the Monroe Ranch late the next day. It wasn't a ranch, it was a fortress. A massive adobe house surrounded by a high wall with armed guards at the gate. This wasn't the home of a cattleman. It was the stronghold of a king. He told the guards he had an urgent message for Clara Monroe from Sheriff Harding. It was a lie, but it was the only one he thought would work. After a long wait, they let him in. He found Clara in a lush garden inside the walls, a place so green and vibrant it didn't seem to belong in the middle of the desert. She was dressed in a fine silk gown, her hair was perfectly styled, and the bruises on her face had faded, covered with powder. She looked like a different person, a stranger. "Elias," she said, her voice cool, guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I came for the truth, Clara," he said, his voice flat. The real truth this time. He told her about what Jed had said in the cell. He told her about what Silas the prospector had seen, the Monroe carriage near the gulch, days before the kidnapping. "Your story has holes in it, Clara," he finished, his eyes boring into hers. "And I have a feeling if I start pulling on the threads, the whole thing is going to come apart." Clara's perfect composure finally broke. Her face crumpled and tears streamed down her cheeks, ruining her makeup. She looked around the garden, at the high walls, at the armed guards. "You don't understand," she sobbed. "This place, it's a prison. My father, he's a monster." And then the real story came out. It was a story of control and cruelty, of a father who saw his daughter as nothing more than a piece of property, a pawn to be married off to the son of a senator to consolidate his power. Samuel Monroe was a tyrant, and Clara had been desperate to escape, so she'd planned it. All of it. The kidnapping was a hoax, a carefully constructed lie to fake her own abduction so she could disappear. And the man who was supposed to help her, the man she was running away to be with, it was Jed, the scarred outlaw, her secret lover. The plan was simple. Jed and his two partners would kidnap her, send a ransom note they knew her father would refuse, and then, under the cover of the fake manhunt, Jed and Clara would slip away and start a new life in California. But the plan went sideways. Jed's partners, a pair of greedy, violent brothers, saw a chance for a real payday. They decided to double-cross Jed, get a real ransom, and then sell Clara. They turned on Jed, beat him, and took control. The fake kidnapping became terrifyingly real. When the posse got close, they broke the wagon and left her for dead, just as she'd told Elias. But the context, the reason why, changed everything. Elias felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He hadn't rescued a helpless victim. He'd stumbled into the middle of a failed conspiracy and dragged its players into the light. The men in the jail weren't just random thugs, and Clara wasn't an innocent. She was a desperate woman whose desperate plan had exploded in her face. "So you lied to me," Elias said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "All of it, a lie." "I was scared," she cried. "What was I supposed to do? Tell a stranger I'd arranged my own kidnapping with an outlaw. You would have handed me right back to my father." Suddenly, the garden felt like a cage. Elias felt the walls closing in. He'd been played by everyone. "Does Harding know?" Elias asked, a new, colder dread seeping into him. "Does the sheriff know the real story?" Clara's eyes widened in fear. "No, no one knows but you." "You can't tell him, Elias. Please, my father would kill Jed, and he would lock me away forever." But as he looked at her, at the raw terror in her eyes, another piece clicked into place. The sheriff's eagerness to close the case. His insistence that Elias take the reward money and forget about it. The way he'd seemed almost satisfied. What if Harding wasn't just an unsuspecting lawman? What if he was part of it too? Elias turned to leave, his mind racing. He had to get back to Dry Creek. He had to find out just how deep this lie went. But as he reached the garden gate, it swung open. Standing there was Samuel Monroe, his face a mask of cold fury. And behind him, looking grim and determined, was Sheriff Tom Harding. "Going somewhere, Carter?" Harding asked, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "I was afraid you might not be smart enough to let things lie." Ellis was trapped. The hero of Dry Creek had just walked into the lion's den, and he was beginning to realize that the lion, the outlaws, and the law were all working together. Samuel Monroe's eyes were like chips of ice. He looked past Elias, his gaze falling on his daughter. "You foolish, foolish girl," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "Did you really think you could disgrace my name and get away with it?" Clara shrank back, all the fight gone out of her. Elias looked at Harding, the man he'd fought alongside in the war, the man he trusted. "Tom, what is this?" Harding's face was grim. "It's complicated, Elias. More complicated than you can imagine." He took a step forward. "The brothers, Jed's partners, they got greedy. After they double-crossed Jed and Clara, they came to me. They offered me a piece of the pie, a big piece. All I had to do was make sure the investigation went a certain way." The ugly truth settled over Elias like a shroud. The plan had mutated. Harding was supposed to rescue Clara, kill the two outlaw brothers in the process to tie up loose ends, and then collect a massive secret reward from Samuel Monroe for saving his daughter and putting down her outlaw lover, Jed. Harding would be a hero, Monroe's family honor would be saved, and the two greedy brothers would have been silenced forever. But Elias had ruined it all. By finding Clara first, he'd screwed up their neat, tidy, bloody little plan. "So the shootout in Dry Creek," Elias said, the pieces falling into place with sickening speed. "That wasn't for justice. You were just cleaning house, getting rid of the witnesses." "They were loose ends," Harding admitted, without a trace of remorse. "And now, so are you." Monroe gestured to his guards. "Take him, and take her. Lock her in her room. We'll deal with him out in the desert. No one will ever find the body." Two burly guards grabbed Elias's arms, twisting them behind his back. He struggled, but there were too many of them. They dragged him out of the garden, through the main house, and toward the front gate. He was being led to his own execution. He had stumbled upon a truth so dark that the only way to protect it was to bury him. As they hauled him past a stable, a sudden commotion erupted. A stable hand shouted, horses whinnied in panic. And then a figure darted out from the shadows. It was Jed, the scarred outlaw. He must have escaped the Dry Creek jail somehow. He held a pitchfork in his hands, his eyes wild and desperate. He wasn't looking at Elias. He was looking for Clara. "Clara!" he yelled. For a split second, everyone was frozen in shock. In that moment of confusion, Elias acted. He stomped down hard on the instep of one guard, elbowing the other viciously in the ribs. He broke free and dove for cover behind a water trough, just as one of Monroe's guards fired a shot. The bullet missed Elias but slammed into the stable wall right next to Jed. Jed, seeing his chance was gone, turned and sprinted for the outer wall, scrambling up it with the desperate agility of a man running for his life. More shots rang out, kicking up dust around his feet, but he was over the top and gone. Harding screamed at the guards, "Get him! Don't let him escape!" Half of the guards took off in pursuit of Jed, while the other half advanced on Elias's position. He was trapped, unarmed, with nowhere to run. But the diversion had given him an idea. In the chaos, no one was paying attention to Samuel Monroe. Elias burst from behind the trough, not at the guards, but straight at the rich landowner. He tackled Monroe, sending them both tumbling to the ground. Elias got his arm around the man's neck, holding him in a chokehold, using his body as a shield. "Nobody move!" Elias yelled, his voice ragged, "or your boss gets his neck snapped." Harding and the remaining guards froze, their guns pointed at Elias, but they couldn't risk a shot. "Let him go, Carter!" Harding snarled. "Not a chance." Elias shot back, dragging the sputtering Monroe to his feet. "You're going to give me a horse, and you're going to let me ride out of here, or I swear to you, I'll break his neck right here in his own courtyard." It was a standoff, a desperate, impossible standoff. Elias Carter, the rancher who just wanted to be left alone, was now holding the most powerful man in the territory hostage, with a corrupt sheriff and a half-dozen hired guns ready to kill him. The West had a funny way of making things complicated. Sheriff Harding's face was a twisted mask of fury. He had Elias dead to rights, but he couldn't risk a shot. Not while Elias had his arm wrapped around Samuel Monroe's throat. "You're a dead man, Carter," Harding growled, his knuckles white on the grip of his revolver. "Maybe," Elias grunted, pulling Monroe tighter. The man was wheezing, his face turning a blotchy purple. "But you're all coming with me. Now get me a horse." One of the guards, his eyes wide with panic, scurried to the stables and led out a saddled mare. He brought it over, keeping a safe distance. "Let my father go!" Clara screamed from the doorway of the house, where two guards were now holding her. "Elias, please!" "Stay out of this, Clara," Elias said, his voice hard. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. He had to stay focused. He backed toward the horse, dragging Monroe with him. Every muscle in his body was coiled tight, ready for the betrayal he knew was coming. He swung his leg over the saddle, never releasing his hold on Monroe. He was half on the horse, an awkward, vulnerable position. This was the moment. They would shoot him now, but the shot never came. From outside the compound walls, a sudden volley of gunfire erupted. The guards chasing Jed were shouting, their shots answered by others. Someone was out there. Jed hadn't just run. He'd run for help. Harding's head whipped around, his eyes wide with alarm. This wasn't part of the plan. Who else could possibly be out there? That brief distraction was all Elias needed. He shoved Samuel Monroe away from him with all his strength, sending the old man sprawling into the dirt. At the same instant, he kicked the horse hard in the flanks. The mare bolted, leaping forward from a standstill, and charged straight for the main gate, which was still open from when Elias had been brought in. Shots exploded behind him. He heard the whiz of bullets flying past his ear. He bent low over the horse's neck, making himself as small a target as possible, and galloped out into the desert. He didn't look back. The gunfire behind him was a chaotic mix now. The guards, Harding, and the unknown shooters outside the walls. Elias rode hard, pushing the horse to its limit, heading for the rocky hills where he could find cover. He had escaped, for now. But he was a man with a price on his head, hunted by the most powerful man in the territory and a corrupt sheriff. He had no horse of his own, no weapon, and no allies. Except maybe one. He had to find Jed. He rode for hours, looping back around, using the terrain to cover his tracks. He finally found them near an old abandoned mine shaft. It was Jed, along with the two outlaw brothers he'd originally hired. It turned out, when Sheriff Harding had locked the brothers up, Jed had convinced them that Harding was planning to betray them all and keep the money for himself, which was true. Jed had helped them break out of the Dry Creek jail, and they'd fled into the desert, nursing a powerful grudge against the sheriff who had double-crossed them. They were a ragged, desperate bunch. Jed looked at Elias with suspicion. "Why should we trust you, rancher? You're the one who ruined everything in the first place. Because right now, I'm the only person in this territory who wants Tom Harding and Samuel Monroe taken down as much as you do," Elias said, his voice steady. "They tried to kill me. They tried to kill you. They have Clara. We can fight amongst ourselves later. Right now, we have the same enemies." A tense, fragile alliance was formed, an alliance of a rancher, an outlaw, and two greedy thugs, bound together by a common desire for revenge. Their plan was insane. It was suicidal. They couldn't fight Monroe's army of guards and Harding's deputies head-on. They had to be smarter. They had to turn their enemies against each other. They knew that Monroe's power came from his reputation and his wealth, and Harding's power came from the badge he wore. If they could strip those things away, they could tear the whole corrupt enterprise down from the inside. Jed knew something no one else did. Samuel Monroe hadn't just made his fortune from cattle. For years, he'd been secretly running a massive silver smuggling operation, using his political connections to move the illegal silver out of the territory. And Sheriff Harding had been the one taking bribes to look the other way. That was their leverage. The proof was in a hidden ledger Monroe kept in a safe in his office. The new plan was born out of desperation. Infiltrate the fortress-like ranch one more time. Steal the ledger and get it to the territorial marshals in Prescott. It was a long shot, but it was the only shot they had. Under the cover of a moonless night, they made their move. The two brothers caused a diversion, setting a fire in a supply shed on the far side of the compound. As most of the guards rushed to fight the blaze, Elias and Jed slipped over the wall, silent as shadows. They moved through the darkened corridors of the massive house. It was a maze, but Jed knew the way. He'd been here before, secretly meeting Clara. They reached the office. The safe was behind a large, gaudy painting of Monroe himself. Jed worked the combination, his fingers deft and sure. Clara had told him the numbers long ago. The heavy steel door swung open, and inside was nothing. The safe was empty. It was a trap. The office doors burst open, and the room was flooded with light from a dozen lanterns. Samuel Monroe stood there, a cruel, triumphant smile on his face. Beside him, Sheriff Harding held a shotgun leveled right at Elias's chest. "I knew you'd come back for her," Monroe sneered at Jed. "And I knew you," he said, turning his cold eyes to Elias. "We're too stubborn to die." Clara was there too, standing behind her father, her face pale and her eyes full of tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "He forced me. He told me he'd kill Jed if I didn't tell him your plan." It was over. They had walked right into the jaws of the trap. Harding's grin was wide and ugly. "This time, Carter," he said, cocking the shotgun, "you stay dead." But Elias was looking at Clara. He saw the terror in her eyes, but he also saw something else. A flicker of defiance. A spark of the same will that had kept her alive in that broken wagon. And he noticed where she was looking. Not at him. Not at her father. She was staring at the massive, ornate desk in the center of the room. The ledger wasn't in the safe. It was somewhere in the desk. "You know, Tom," Elias said, his voice surprisingly calm, forcing Harding to pause for a second, "I always wondered, in the war, at the Battle of Stony Ridge, our whole platoon was pinned down, but you managed to sneak away. You always said you went for help, but the help never came. We lost half our men that day." Harding's face darkened. "What are you talking about, Carter? This isn't the time for war stories." "I think it is," Elias said, taking a slow step to the side, positioning himself closer to the desk. "Because I think you didn't go for help. I think you ran, just like you're running now, hiding behind a rich man's money and a tin badge." The taunt hit its mark. Harding's eyes blazed with fury. "Shut your mouth!" In that instant, everything happened at once. Elias kicked the leg of the heavy desk with all his might. The massive piece of furniture tilted, groaned, and then crashed over onto its side, right toward Sheriff Harding. Harding stumbled back to avoid being crushed, his shotgun firing into the ceiling. Jed lunged, not at Harding, but at Samuel Monroe, tackling him to the ground. And Clara? Clara screamed and grabbed a heavy silver inkstand from the ruined desk and threw it with all her strength. It smashed the main lantern, and the office was plunged into sudden, suffocating darkness, punctuated by the panicked shouts of the guards. Chaos erupted. In the dark, Elias scrambled for the fallen shotgun. His hands found the cool metal. He didn't know who was who. He just knew he had to get out. A figure loomed up in front of him, a guard. Elias swung the shotgun like a club, and the man went down with a grunt. "Clara!" he yelled into the darkness. "The ledger!" A drawer had broken open when the desk had fallen. By the faint moonlight filtering through the window, Elias saw Clara on her hands and knees, pulling a thick, leather-bound book from the wreckage. She had it. "Go!" Jed yelled from somewhere in the dark. "Get it out of here! Go!" Elias grabbed Clara's hand, pulling her toward the window. He smashed the glass with the butt of the shotgun, and they scrambled out into the night, leaving the shouts and the chaos behind them. They ran. They ran for their lives, the precious ledger clutched in Clara's hands. The proof that could burn this whole rotten empire to the ground. They had the evidence. But they were still miles from safety, hunted in the dark by men who had nothing left to lose. The final, desperate race had just begun. They ran until their lungs burned, melting into the vast, dark desert. Behind them, the Monroe Ranch was a hive of frantic activity, lanterns bobbing like angry fireflies as guards and horses were organized for the hunt. They knew they couldn't outrun them for long. "We have to split up," Elias said, his voice raspy. "They'll be looking for two people. You take the Ledger, head south. I'll lead them west." Clara shook her head, her eyes wide in the darkness. "No, I'm not leaving you." "You have to," he insisted, gripping her shoulders. "Getting that book to Prescott is the only thing that matters now. It's not about us anymore. It's about Jed. It's about every person your father and Harding have ever hurt. This is bigger than us. Now go." He gave her a gentle push, and after a moment's hesitation, she turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. Elias took a deep breath and started running west, making as much noise as he could, leaving a clear trail for them to follow. He was the bait. He was drawing the wolves away from the one thing that could stop them. It wasn't long before he heard the hoofbeats. They were coming fast. He found a small outcropping of rocks and wedged himself into a narrow crevice. The empty shotgun clutched in his hands. This was it. This was his last stand. Sheriff Harding was in the lead, his face lit by the moonlight, a mask of pure rage. "He's in there!" Harding yelled. "Flush him out!" They dismounted, spreading out, their rifles ready. Elias was trapped. He had no bullets, no escape. He could hear their boots crunching on the gravel as they got closer. He closed his eyes, thinking of the ranch he'd lost, of the simple life that had been stolen from him. And then he heard a new sound, a different sound, a single clear bugle call cutting through the night. Harding and his men froze. They looked around confused. The bugle call came again, closer this time. And then from over the rise, a line of dark figures on horseback appeared, their forms silhouetted against the starry sky. They weren't Monroe's men. They were uniformed soldiers. United States Territorial Marshals. Clara hadn't run south. She had run straight for the main road, where by some miracle, she had flagged down a patrol that was on its way to investigate rumors of smuggling in the area. She had shown them the Ledger. Harding's face went pale. The trap he had set had now sprung on him. His men looked at him, then at the approaching marshals, and they threw down their guns. It was over. The law, the real law, had arrived. Harding stood alone, his face a mess of disbelief and fury. He looked at the marshals, then at the rocks where Elias was hiding. With a final, desperate scream of rage, he raised his revolver and fired blindly into the crevice. Elias felt a white-hot, searing pain tear through his shoulder. He cried out, slumping against the rock wall as darkness started to creep in at the edges of his vision. The last thing he heard before he passed out was the thunderous sound of a dozen rifles firing at once. When Elias woke up, the first thing he saw was Clara's face, her eyes filled with tears of relief. He was lying in a clean bed in the doctor's office back in Dry Creek. His shoulder was bandaged, and the sun was streaming through the window. It was all over. Samuel Monroe and his entire operation had been brought down. The Ledger told the marshals everything. His empire, built on lies and silver, crumbled to dust. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. Sheriff Harding was dead. Jed and the two brothers, in exchange for their testimony, were given lighter sentences. Jed, before being taken away, had asked to see Clara one last time. They spoke quietly, and then he was gone. A chapter of her life, closed forever. A few days later, Elias was sitting on the porch of the doctor's office, his arm in a sling, watching the people of Dry Creek try to get back to normal. The town had a new, honest sheriff, and the shadow of fear had been lifted. Clara came and sat beside him. The fancy clothes were gone. She was back in a simple dress, her hair tied back. She looked more like the woman he'd found in the desert. "The reward money is still at the bank," she said softly. "My father's assets are frozen, but that was set aside for you legally. It's yours. You can rebuild your ranch." Elias looked out at the dusty street. "I'm not sure that's who I am anymore." "Who are you then?" she asked. He was quiet for a long time. "I'm the man who stopped writing," he said finally. She was leaving. With her father's crimes exposed, there was nothing for her in Arizona but bad memories. She was taking a stagecoach to California. to start a new life where the name Monroe meant nothing, where she could just be Clara. She stood up to leave. "Will I ever see you again, Elias?" He looked up at her, at the woman he had been through hell and back with. "I don't know," he said, and it was the honest truth. "But I have a feeling our trails will cross again someday." She smiled, a real, genuine smile. She leaned down and kissed him gently on the cheek. Then she turned and walked to the stagecoach without looking back. Elias Carter sat on that porch and watched until the stagecoach was nothing but a tiny speck of dust on the horizon. He had lost his home. He'd been shot, beaten, and betrayed. But as he sat there with the warm sun on his face, he knew he hadn't lost the things that truly mattered. He had faced down the darkness and chosen to do the right thing, no matter the cost. Out here in the West, a rope can save a man, or it can bind him. But sometimes you have to be the one to cut the rope, even if it means bringing the whole world crashing down around you. The story of Elias Carter and Clara Monroe became a legend in that part of the territory, a story whispered around campfires for years to come. A story about how one man's simple choice to stop on a dusty trail could unravel an empire and change the course of so many lives. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other secrets are buried out there under the endless sky, just waiting for the right person to come along and dig them up? If you enjoyed this ride into the dark heart of the West, and you believe that one person can still make a difference, then do us a favor. Hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs a reminder about courage, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Because we have a lot more trails to explore, and a lot more stories waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss a single one.